guys, welcome to Let Hallie Read. For today's Throwback Thursday video, we are going to look at two of my most favorite children's books, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll and The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. The reason I wanted to do a Throwback Thursday with these two books specifically is because I actually wrote my master's dissertation over these two books. This is my master's thesis. In 2015, I moved to the UK and went to grad school at the University of Kent in Canterbury, England. While I was there, I wrote this bad boy, and I just wanted to revisit it. It's probably been like 2-3 years since I've even laid eyes on this, so I thought it'd be really fun to revisit it and look at maybe just some of the things that I talked about and some of the things that I dove into when it came to these books. I've always been fascinated with how dark children's literature can get. But when it was time to choose our topics, I ultimately decided to explore some of that darkness that I think comes out of the books. So let's get a little bit of background first about these two authors. Carroll and Burnett were Victorian writers, which the Victorian period, if you don't know, lasted from 1837 to 1901 during Queen Victoria's reign. Burnett can also be seen as an Edwardian author because she wrote during the Edwardian period, which lasted from 1901 to 1910. The Secret Garden was actually written in that time frame, but her other very popular children's books were written during the Victorian period. So she kind of toes that line between both eras. Here's the thing that you need to know about Victorian authors. They were obsessed with two things: death and childhood innocence and purity, and oftentimes they would put the two together, most notably Charles Dickens. A lot of the children's literature during this time was meant to teach and edify children, and Burnett and Carroll didn't really like that. They sought to write books that would amuse children and let them enjoy it as kids and let them stay in that childhood. My thesis explores the themes around death and violence and mortality in the Alice books and in The Secret Garden. I've always been really interested in what was going on in these authors' lives while they were writing these books, and knowing what was going on in Burnett's and Carroll's lives really gave me a lot of insight into the major themes in the books, because I do believe that they took a lot from their personal lives and put it into their writing. One of the books I relied on heavily was Lewis Carroll's A Biography by Morton in Cohen. I relied on a lot of books, but when it came to aspects of his life, this is the book that I went to. There's a famous story about Lewis Carroll and how he got the inspiration to write Alice in Wonderland. He wrote it based off of a girl named Alice Liddell, and in 1862 he took Alice and her two sisters on a boat ride along the Thames. Alice asked Lewis Carroll if he would tell them a story, and so he told them a story. That story ended up being Alice's Adventures Underground, which I do have a copy. So this was the original. This is not the Alice in Wonderland that we know of today. I was able to get this in a little shop in Oxford. There is a shop there that used to be an actual general store that the real Alice would go to when she was young, and now they've turned it into a touristy, shop. Alice's Adventures Underground turned into what we know as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Carroll's relationship with Alice Liddell and her family was very close for a long time. If you know anything about Lewis Carroll, he liked to do photography, and some of that photography was pretty sketchy, but he liked to do portraits of people. Alice Liddell's mother hired him on, and they became really, really close. In 1863, a year after that famous boat ride, they had a big falling out. No one knows why. There's no record telling us what happened between the Liddells and Lewis Carroll. Cohen believes that what happened was that Lewis Carroll may have asked Alice Liddell's mother for Alice's hand in marriage. This is the Victorian era, and that actually wouldn't have been super scandalous or anything. It was very normal for older men to become betrothed to younger girls, and then they would just wait until the girl is 18 or so, legal age, and then they would get married. So it really wasn't anything scandalous, but apparently it may have offended Mrs. Liddell. So when I was learning these things about Lewis Carroll, I realized that around the time of this happening, he was writing his first book, and we see a lot of anger portrayed through Alice and a sense of melancholy through the Looking Glass. When Alice Liddell's mother broke it off, he had no more contact with Alice. And I think that really affected him. And so, you know, the Alice that he portrays in the book is someone he is trying to keep he's trying to keep her in girlhood. He's trying to maintain her innocence and maintain who she is forever, because the real Alice Liddell has moved on from him. One of the main things I talk about is the fact that Alice, the character Alice in the beginning of the books, is seen as this very prim Victorian girl, and as she makes her way through Wonderland, she becomes more violent. Carroll kind of explains away some of this violence by making it very clear to the audience that Alice is losing her Victorian primness, but she's doing it in a way that she doesn't really understand why. When she threatens the flowers and she says, you know, if you don't hold your tongues, I'll pick you. And she doesn't understand that to the flowers, that means death. And there is the moment where she's threatening the mouse and she says that her cat Dinah is, quote, such a capital one for catching mice. And again, these are just all like these unknowing threats that she's giving them that all allude to death. Carroll the whole time strives to maintain his child character's innocence. He never wants her to become aware of what she's doing. So the whole time it's like she's unknowingly doing these things to keep his child character in innocence by keeping her alive and just kind of trapping her in this wonderland. But the problem is Alice doesn't want to be in this wonderland, so she's fighting to get out, which brings out her violence, brings out threats. Finally, we have the courtroom scene. Alice acts out her final act of violence and aggression. What finally gets her out of Wonderland is fully shedding the Victorian breeding. So she has an outburst, and her final words are, you know, who cares for you? You're nothing but a pack of cards. At the end, when she finally just kind of bursts out, it expresses that Alice is able to act out violently without repercussions because she does not belong to the world that she's in. So she can get away with it. The world that Lewis Carroll has created for her is a world where she can get away with being a child, not being prim and Victorian and innocent even. And then we move into Through the Looking Glass, and we have a switch of tone. The Looking Glass was published 6 years after Alice in Wonderland. The Alice that is in this book, Through the Looking Glass, is not as angry as she once was. And instead of desperately trying to leave, she journeys through Looking Glass Land in the hopes that she will become a queen. Kind of an image of adulthood, going into womanhood at this point. And I think that's what the sadness around it is that Lewis Carroll didn't want his child character to grow up, but it's not something that he can really force on her now. That's Carroll finally coming to terms with his own aging and the aging of his child friend. He was very much like normal Victorian writers where, you know, he believed in the childhood innocence and purity, but is very much against the death of children to show their innocence. One of the books I used for my Lewis Carroll studying was The Annotated Alice by Morton Gardner. He does a lot of annotated books, and I don't have the book with me because I couldn't bring it back to me from England. It wouldn't fit in my suitcase, unfortunately. But I do have The Annotated Secret Garden, which this one's by Gretchen Holbrook Gerzina, and this is the biography I used when I was researching The Secret Garden, also by Gretchen Gerzina. So I relied pretty heavily on this one when I was doing my research into her personal life. Let's move on to Burnett. So kind of to recap Carroll. Carroll was all about keeping his child in childhood innocence, keeping her a child forever, making her stay in Wonderland. And then when he realized that he couldn't, Alice Through the Looking Glass is a little bit more melancholy because he's finally coming to terms with the fact that he can't keep his child in innocence any longer. Then we move over to The Secret Garden. She takes a different approach at keeping her child in innocence, and she has different motives than Carroll did. That's why I wanted to put them two together, because they were both trying to keep their children like children, but they were doing it for different reasons. And a lot of it had to do with what was going on in their lives. The Secret Garden was published in 1911. And I think she was like writing it during the Edwardian, but it didn't get published until after. It's important to note that a lot of The Secret Garden has Victorian themes and Victorian tropes that she brought in. In the height of Burnet's popularity, she traveled a lot back and forth from America to England. And she was away from her family quite a bit. And she had two sons, and one of her sons was Lionel. Lionel was kind of a sickly guy, but he was also a little bit of a hypochondriac. So it was kind of hard to know when his illnesses needed to be taken seriously. 1889, that area, that time frame, Burnet was in America with her oldest son, Vivian. Her son, Lionel, went to London with his father. And this is when his illness began to decline and get worse. And then he ended up dying. A lot of The Secret Garden stems from her guilt for not being there when Lionel died, but also not getting a cure for him. She got very much into like spiritualism, and a lot of that is in The Secret Garden. It's very heavily represented in that book. But like spiritualism and like nature and the healing powers of nature, that's a huge, huge theme in this book. It is often seen as her penance for not being able to find a cure for her son. And that's why, we have Colin, the sickly figure, who ends up becoming better because of the healing powers of nature. Colin is hidden away because it is believed that he is fragile and really, really ill and has like scoliosis, and we find out that he actually doesn't have any of that. It's just that he doesn't get out into the sun. Colin is a pretty unpleasant kid, but so is Mary. Mary's a very, very unpleasant kid. She was raised in India, and she did not have good parents at all. They ended up dying of cholera. That's why she had to go and live with Colin and his father in England. So there's a lot of imagery about how England is seen as this Garden of Eden. The reason that Mary and Colin are so awful is because they haven't gone out into the English nature. And so it becomes very evident that once they get out into England and get out into the garden, we slowly start seeing these improvements between Colin and Mary. They start becoming nicer. Colin is able to gain a lot of his strength back, and it all like centers around the garden's healing power. Burnet was definitely against the Victorian sentiment of childhood innocence, and we have Mary and Colin, who are not kind, they're not self-sacrificing, they're not even good-looking children, and most Victorian authors will write their children as very angelic and self-sacrificing and edifying, and she was like, no, these are just real children, and this is what happens when we neglect them. We have these similarities between Wonderland and the garden. Burnet did not want Mary to feel the weight of her own actions, so she gives her an excuse, just like Carroll gave Alice an excuse. She makes it known that Mary is able to maintain her childlike innocence because it's really the adult's fault that she is the way she is. It's the fact that she's never been into the English garden. So both of these authors give their children a lot of slack for the decisions and the actions, they make. They both had different motivations to keep their children in innocence. So in many ways, they were very stereotypically Victorian, but they tried really hard to put a twist on it and to not go down the same path that other Victorian writers did. To read a little bit of my conclusion. Lewis Carroll and Frances Hodgson Burnett, while using different writing styles, portray the same passion for keeping their fictional and real children in the literary garden. Carroll's Alice books were influenced by his love of a young girl, the frustration in losing her, and the gradual acceptance of her maturity. With these elements, he created a timeless story that engages with death, characterization, dark humor, nonsense, and parodies in order to evaluate the ways in which Victorian society viewed and treated the angelic and innocent child. It's not really something I talked about in the video, but I go more in depth in like some of his dark humor and like the nonsense language. And then Burnet was similarly influenced by a loss of a child, but her narrative takes on greater weight as she was trying to come to terms with the death of her son Lionel and her selfish behavior when he was ill. That's something I think I skipped over too. When he was ill, she started taking care of orphans, and it was almost like she was just trying to make up for what she wasn't doing for her own son. The Secret Garden served as her atonement and a critique of parental love and the societal expectations placed on children. Burnett's beliefs in the powerful effects of nature and religion served to transform two unpleasant yet innocent children who have been taken out of the English garden and successfully attempts to place them back. Carroll and Burnett worked together to create a safe and otherworldly space within their separate stories, and it is through their exploration of innocence, mortality, and death that they are able to assess Victorian society. So that was my dissertation. I feel like I really skimmed through it. A lot more I talked about, but I really didn't want this to be like a let me read my dissertation kind of video. I really want it to be like just a discussion of, you know, what you guys see in the themes in these books. And if maybe I'm not the only one that kind of saw some of this. Thanks for sticking around. Let me know what you think about these children's books. Guys, have a great day.